Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce, joined by my co-host, Tyler West. Today, we're going to start a new series. It's a short one, just 2 episodes on the Apostle Paul, specifically his missionary journeys. This was a part of the request. I think it'll be a fun one to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, when you're looking at Paul and his life and all that he went through, it's kind of extraordinary because he died technically kind of young, being put to death. But looking at his life in general, with the limitation of what he didn't have that we do, see planes, bus, car, boat. Now they had boats, but they weren't motorized.
Right.
I mean, how much ground the man traveled? Not once, not twice, could be argued 4 times.
He wore out several pairs of sandals.
Sandals, horses, boats.
Right.
I mean, shipwrecked. I mean, the guy went
Camels.
through so much.
Right.
But how much of an influence he had on his generation and even today impacting our generation for the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the most unlikely candidate to do it. When we look at the life of Paul, he was against Christianity. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, he said.
Top notch.
Trained under the great Gamaliel. But he wasn't looking for God in the sense of through Jesus of Nazareth, but God was certainly looking for him because as a result, he meets Jesus on the road to persecute Christians and imprison them.
Mm-hmm.
And he's knocked off his horse, blinded, called out, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, who you're persecuting." Next thing you know, he's taking off. He goes, he finds Ananias. Ananias heals him, baptizes him. He's called to be an apostle of the Gentiles. Now, that took place probably about 4 years or so after Jesus. He didn't, you read Acts, and this is the difficult part. Sometimes you read Acts and you turn a page and 6 months go by and it feels like 6 seconds.
Right. Yeah.
Or a year and a half or 2.
Mm-hmm. Especially within the first 3 chapters of Acts, there's time span
Rapid.
over here.
So you hit Pentecost and it's like, oh, well, we're on the next day after Pentecost.
No, there's
longer.
Right after Pentecost, there's like a year gap.
So, I mean, just going into Paul's conversion alone, you're about 4 years after Pentecost.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets converted. It's around year 37. He goes through these missionary journeys all the way to his death, which is about 67 to 68 AD by Nero. So when you're talking about a 30-year ministry, he travels a lot in 30 years. He goes through a lot of physical turmoil with his own afflictions just internally, then external afflictions, beaten with rods, hit with whips,
bitten by snakes,
snake
shipwrecked.
bites. I mean, the guy was resilient.
Right, to say the least.
Apparently has bad eyesight.
Right. Been lowered down with baskets. I mean, it's
constantly hunted in his ministry.
Yep.
So looking at him, he's converted. Not long after, he is paired up with Barnabas. Barnabas is introduced in Acts chapter number 4, going to Acts number 5. He is the son of consolation, the perfect guy that Paul really needed. Churches were skeptical about him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're like, wait, isn't this the guy that was persecuting the church? My cousin Joe over here got put in prison by him.
Well, that's Ananias' first response when it's like, God, really rather not go visit this guy from what he's doing and putting people in prison and persecuting them. You sure you got the right one?
And as a result, it took somebody to really speak on his behalf.
Right. And when you really look at the timeline, it's almost 10 years by the time he gets to Barnabas after spending the 3 years in the wilderness and kind of just doing his own thing. He finally meets the apostles and
he gets to meet Peter.
Right. And so by the time he gets to Barnabas, you're talking almost 10 years.
And he needed that 10 years. Specifically, he had to learn to convert everything he learned in Judaism, which was mostly true, and how that was fulfilled in the person of Christ. Right. The apostles had a head start on him. Yeah, they had 3 years, Jesus pointing things out. And even then, they had to process things.
Yeah, I think
Paul had to undo a lot of things.
Yeah, sure. And he probably had to be softened a little bit because, especially in modern times, we get that cage stage when we move into a new thing. So I'm sure Paul, the man who was super zealous for Judaism, probably came out of the gate, pretty zealous for Christianity too. And he stayed very zealous for Christianity, but he probably needed a little softening.
I'm sure he felt lied to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he felt like that his teaching was impartial or favoritism.
Yep.
So
people had skipped whole sections of like Isaiah and
Isaiah 53. I'm
yeah.
sure when he got to Isaiah 53,
He was like
that became
light
a
bulbs,
big deal.
right?
And looking at Isaiah 40, Isaiah chapter number 6. See, the apostles, they had time to really process some of that. Paul's catching up.
Right.
And it was good for him to have a guy like Barnabas in his first missionary journey. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the stage for those that are actually watching this on YouTube. Those that are listening, we apologize. Make it up in your mind, envision this a little bit.
Yeah.
Paul's missionary journeys were unique in the sense of their location, because after the persecution of the church of Jerusalem, they dispersed really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You find people, the headquarters itself seems to go to Antioch, where Peter would become really its first leader in the church of Antioch. That's the headquarters. It's the location where the term Christian originated, little Christ. It was not meant to be a compliment, but they took it as one.
Right.
And so Christians were first called Christians in Antioch. And it kind of became the home base. So when Paul would do his missionary journeys and he'd come back, he would give a lot of his reports in Antioch. Sometimes he had to go down to Jerusalem, but Syria was the main location. The book of Acts says many believed in Jesus there, and it flourished in the city of Antioch, became a very prominent location for the apostles and many of those they were sending out on their own missionary journeys in addition to Paul.
Right.
Now on the map here, you're going to see Syria is the first place where we are landing, and then he's going to take off to the area of Cyprus. Now, when you get to his first missionary journey, you find Cyprus to be important. He takes Barnabas with them. Also, they take a young man by the name of John Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Now, John Mark is an instrumental person that kind of gets ignored after a while in the book of Acts. You're kind of left with he was a coward. But it's actually Peter that we see him with him in First Peter. He has John Mark with him in Rome. And then we see later on that Paul actually says he's now profitable.
Right. Some sort of reconciliation has happened at some point during their lives.
Now, a little nepotism got him on this journey to begin with. He's related to Barnabas. So Barnabas' sister Mary is important because she was actually housing the apostles, and there was apparently church and gatherings that happened in her house. We find that when Peter was in prison and James was killed, it was her house they were meeting at and praying when Peter was able to escape prison, sitting at the door knocking while they're praying for him, like,
right.
Let me in. But she was important. So based on John Mark's mom, this relationship to Barnabas, he travels with them. They go out in Acts chapter number 12. Or excuse me, he's mentioned specifically to his mother in Acts chapter 12. They go to Cyprus. Now, Cyprus is like a giant island.
Mm-hmm.
They sail from Seleucia. They come to the island of Cyprus. It's about 100 miles from the area of the headquarters church. There, they start seeing converts, but they do run into issues, like everywhere. They're opposed spiritually by a magician when they get to Cyprus. So kind of insight on that. What do you think is ironic that Acts records us? They get to the island of Cyprus. They're instantly met. And it seems like this happens. Peter's met by magicians. Paul's met by magicians. This becomes a regular opposition. We find later, even in Eusebius's writings, how many of the early church fathers were constantly opposed by magicians.
Mm-hmm. And you see this in Jesus's ministry too. Anytime he walked into a city, the things that were demon possessed were crying out, you are the Son of God, you are the Son of God. And you kind of see the magician, kind of thing that keeps popping up. It's very demonic. It's very, they recognize the apostles are coming in the authority of Jesus, and they're immediately opposing them. Or, we see later on in Paul's missionary journeys where they're just following him around and irritating the crap out of Paul and saying, you are the Son of, or, you serve the Most High, you serve the Most High, you are prophets of the Most High, whatever. And it's anytime people that are authentically there for Jesus, it's like the darkness kind of comes around it and starts to cause all these problems. So really, to me, it's an indication of the power and authority that Paul was walking in there with, that Barnabas was walking in there with. that these were men of God. And it kind of plays out the same way that when Jesus strolled into town, that these things happened as well. It's a continuation and a proof of their ministry.
Yeah, and I don't think that the magician in the term we use today, people are doing disguise. A lot of these magicians were actually doing supernatural things.
They talk about Simon Magus, that they like he was like the hand of God, as like they put that he was doing things through God, even though there was some deceptive stuff there, but like he was actually doing miracles the same way that I think and look back to like the Pharaoh's magicians in Exodus that were able to
Janus and Jambres,
right? They were able to replicate the same things Moses was doing at the beginning. So,
but Moses' snake swallowed the staves that come in the snakes there, showing the power of God over the power of the gods of Egypt. And we find that even here, when they get to Cyprus, Paul blinds this man, showing power of God and Holy Spirit over against the magicianal powers of the false prophet.
Right. These guys weren't just pulling rabbits out of hats. They were really, really doing some significant stuff.
They weren't doing kid shows.
Right.
There was a little bit more to it than that. Now, then they leave Cyprus, and Luke tells us that Paul's name, there's kind of this transition of his name. He went from Saul to Paul. There's theories about this, and I don't want to like pick a side on this, that Paul himself already had two names, and they wanted to use the newer name, or that his name was actually changed. I've seen people lose their cool over this point. It really doesn't matter. Can I see the need to change name as the basis of he was Saul, the persecutor of the church, to Paul, the building of churches? Sure, that makes sense. I mean, we see multiple apostles' names change, Simon to Peter. I mean,
right. But he was also called Cephas, and like the multiple name thing between the Gentile and the Jew is a common situation too. So it's debatable. But it doesn't actually matter.
It doesn't, but we do see the transition.
Yes.
Luke at this
he starts to just start calling him Paul.
Absolutely. And then from over in this place, they go to Pamphylia and Galatia. Now, this becomes important because we don't have a letter to the Pamphylians, but we do have one to the Galatians. A very important letter, especially when it comes to the teaching of Judaism and how it relates to faith in God, to dependence on the works of the law to get you into the kingdom of God. Now, he starts this church. The church does good. He speaks about them. And then apparently false teachers come in saying, no, we circumcision is necessary.
Right.
So these churches become very important to Paul's ministry letters later. Again, Pamphylia itself does not receive one, but it's in this place that Paul and Barnabas and John Mark, they go across the Mediterranean, they get into Pamphylia, and it's John Mark here at this location. He deserts cousin Barnabas and Paul, and he heads back to Jerusalem. That's in Acts chapter number 13.
Right.
Now, in this persecution, Paul didn't back down. Now, he's constantly being approached by issues here, but they do lose John Mark. And this is where the tension will come later, because later Barnabas wants to bring him again. But these churches become some of the earliest churches Paul writes to, which is why we believe later that Galatians is probably one of the earlier letters of Paul.
Right. Starts off right at the beginning. And with John Mark, I think that intense level of persecution just got too much. He was seeing too much. He's persecuted so hard. And honestly, I've got sympathy for him. You know, if I was tagging along with Barnabas and Paul and saw some of the stuff that they saw and got persecuted the way that they did, I mean, it'd be harder for me to continue to go on. So I think I throw him a little bit more grace than some people do.
It's
also possible that he was very young.
He's a young guy.
Yeah.
I mean, and it becomes profitable later, as Paul said. And I think the reason for that, and I've mentioned on the show multiple times, is because he penned the gospel of Mark for Peter, which demonstrated his value in ministry.
Right.
But when you look at this travel in Galatia specifically, it's constantly the Jews that give Paul problems. The first thing he would do when he would go to a city like Galatia or Pamphylia, he would go to these areas and he would go to the synagogues. Typically, that's what got him in trouble more than the Gentiles. Now, Gentiles give him trouble too, but
different way.
In a way, he gets there and he starts teaching Jesus is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophets. Therefore, you need to turn and repent and believe in Jesus. Gets him ran out of.
Right. And it goes to, Paul even talks about, like, that's his philosophy, that the gospel came to the Jew first and then the Gentile. And so in his missionary practices, he goes to the Jew first in the synagogue, and then he goes into the marketplace for the Gentiles.
Now, it does tell us that even though he was opposed in the marketplaces by the Gentiles and synagogues, people still usually ended up believing. It's not like nobody believed.
Right, yeah.
In fact, in Acts chapter 13, it tells us specifically that many people came to faith in Jesus as a result of his message.
Yep.
It was the minority that got upset about it that actually caused them the problem.
They were a vicious minority.
Very vicious. So they faced major persecution and opposition at this section of their ministry. And the Jews became jealous, started to contradict what Paul was saying, started turning the Gentiles against him. It's never good when the Jews and Gentiles had to team up because they had to have a common issue to do that.
Was that the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
That's how it goes. And that's what happens in his ministry journeys. So from there, he takes off. He goes to Iconium. So he leaves this area, travels eastward, goes further into the Galatia region. And then he arrives in Iconium. There they preach, do miracles in the name of Jesus. Similar things happen here as it did earlier. Paul goes in the synagogues. He goes into Iconium, into their synagogues. He teaches. Jews, Greeks believe in Jesus, but vicious Judaizers stir up trouble for Paul. They end up turning the whole city and dividing it in Acts chapter 14.
Right. And then, after the division happens, they hear these rumors about Paul and Barnabas that they're going to be stoned.
They're trying to kill him.
Right. They're trying to kill him. And so that's their cue to move on out.
and then it's not like they necessarily wanted to. It's a lot of people had to tell them, like, this is best. Like, you need to get out. I mean, your life's in trouble. Now, I would say that, oh, good, he escaped persecution there. That's not actually what happens because we find he goes to Lystra and Derbe next. And in Lystra and Derbe, he actually finds the same problem. Now, I'm going to pull the map back up again to those watching. You're going to find here his travels. So Cyprus, he goes over. Now he's in Lystra and Derbe. And then he finds issues there. He performs a miracle causing a crippled man to actually walk again.
Right.
Now, when this happens, the people in the air, they assume that Barnabas and Paul were some sort of gods.
Yep.
So, I mean, they must be some sort of gods. They're taking a man that's crippled. Now, this wasn't unusual for Jerusalem and Antioch because at that point, they'd already seen major miracles like this. I mean, people are walking past Peter's shadow getting healed. Paul does miracles later in his ministry, but the other apostles were already doing things like this. Even in Acts chapter number 3, at the Gate of Beautiful, a man who was lame from birth gets healed by Peter and John.
Yep.
This is new for these areas.
Right.
And they're pagans. They're less ritualistic to the Jewish faith.
Which is why they think that Paul and Barnabas are Zeus and the other god that kind of does more of the speaking. And that's the response is, oh, they must be the gods come down. And so they start trying to worship them as
Greek gods. They turn them into Greek gods instantly. Now, they're not thrilled about this.
Right.
Barnabas are not.
They tear their clothes and they lament. They continue to preach, but they don't quite get it in Lystra and Derbe. I think too much had happened with the priests starting to worship them that it was chaos.
And so you think that from the chaos, it would just be from that city. But because he's causing problems pretty much in every town and place he goes, next thing you know, unbelieving Jews from Iconium, where they were just previously, travel. It's not a far distance. They travel to Lystra and Derbe.
It's like a mobile lynch mob is coming after him, following him right behind the missionary journey.
Like, did he do that in your town too? Hey, he did that in our town.
Let's get him.
Let's get him. I mean, that's the way this goes for him.
Yep.
So they stir up trouble for them there. They convince the people of Lystra to stone Paul, and they leave him for dead outside the city.
It's interesting to me that it doesn't mention that they stoned Barnabas. That dynamic is just always
is interesting.
It's just left out. It's just Paul that gets stoned.
Maybe he was a faster runner and he got out of there.
Poor guy, kind of a John and Peter thing. He got to the tomb first.
John was faster than Peter. Barnabas was faster. Maybe Paul wasn't, he can't see and he took a wrong turn.
Barnabas could have just been nicer.
He is the son of consolation.
So maybe we like him, but we hate him. Let's get him.
And it's no doubt that Peter, like Peter with John, was the spokesman.
Yeah,
Paul is probably the spokesman.
Absolutely.
In this group. Barnabas is more the second hand, right behind you, buddy.
Hype man.
It doesn't say, and Luke doesn't tell us. Part of that could be because at this point, Luke was not yet traveling with Paul, and he's just giving factual things.
Right.
One of my defenses of the Gospel of Luke and Acts being Luke in authorship, and if you missed those, go back in the archives. You can find my argument for Acts is that Luke, when he's on this spot with Paul, more details are given.
And it's it switches. We were there.
We were there and
We
things
were
like
there.
that.
Yeah.
So he's getting this information from Paul.
Mhm.
At this point, he's going to spend his time focusing on Paul,
Right.
because that's really all the data he's going to get. I'm sure he met Barnabas. I think at times I do believe that Luke crossed paths with Barnabas in the travels, but his material is coming from Paul, so we should naturally expect him to receive the Paul was stoned and left for dead. It's his story to
Right.
tell.
Yeah.
No, he's not dead. It doesn't. There's question, even debate. Well, he did die, but something happened. But it says he was left for dead outside of the city. But Paul doesn't seem to have died there, but he walked back into the city in Acts chapter 14.
That's a bold move, man.
It's like, man, that hurt,
All
All right, where's the? All right, I got to head back. So he heads back.
You guys got some Band-Aids?
Yeah, right. I'm bleeding. Tough guy. He is a tough
very,
guy.
very tough guy. Well, Jesus did tell him, he's going to have to find out how much he's going to suffer for my name's sake when he gets, converted. So
I wonder how much thinking he did in remembrance of stoning, because he was a part of the stoning of Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
You got to wonder if he sat back and said, man, I'm feeling this deeper than the wounds in the body.
Yeah. I think Paul lived most of his life with deep regret for that transition period where he was at. I think it was one of the things that plagued him.
It had to have plagued him, and he had to continually go back to the grace of God.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this was a reminder of who he was and where he has come from.
Yep.
So Barnabas and Paul then continue on to Derbe the next day. They preach. Multiple people get saved. I mean, a guy was stoned and left for dead, and you come back and you preach your next sermon.
I'm listening to that guy.
I mean, how many pastors call out of preaching their sermon with a, little congestion? I mean,
right.
This guy's over there with wounds all over him from stoning.
Mm-hmm.
He's preaching a sermon. Acts 14:21, people get saved.
Yep.
It's incredible. So they face persecution, tribulation, multiple ways. Paul and Barnabas began their journey back home. They decided that they needed to travel back. So they go back through Galatia,
mm-hmm.
where they had just seen many converts come to faith. Now, if you go on the map that we talked about, and I'm going to pull it back up again, and I'm so sorry for those that listen to the podcast, but
look up a map and while you're listening and just follow along.
Follow along. It'll help you. And if you have a Bible, a lot of the maps are actually in the back of the Bible just for Paul's missionary journeys. So they go back through Galatia, and when you look at the map, you'll see that it could have been a much faster route to travel to Derbe directly to Antioch. Now, I know why Paul did it, because the Bible kind of tells us in Acts why. There were a lot of disciples there, and he felt like they needed further instruction. It's not that Paul always took the easiest route.
Yep.
He did a lot of times take the hardest route, but what he believed to be the best route.
And he comes back and he establishes leadership in these churches, because you got to think this trip was 18 months ish, somewhere in that. And so these are new converts, these are new churches, these are new groups of believers. It's not like he left a seasoned pastor with him, and somebody really take care of him. So he comes back and he's appointing leadership, he's appointing elders, and checking on them to make sure that the persecution that's followed him the whole way has not come back and destroyed the work that he's already done. So he's emboldening them. And when you hear the stories of him going all the way through and surviving the persecution and coming back, and that's the guy leading your charge and saying, no, I went through this and we're going to still keep trucking. It's very encouraging to these new believers that not only is this man who established these churches really in the thick of it with you, but he's continuing to champion it even through the persecution. It gives you hope to continue.
It gives you hope that
to move on.
This man's not selling to something,
right?
He's got nothing to gain.
Mm-hmm.
He's leaning into his call, and he's convinced of what he's been told and seen and experienced to be true, and he'll go to the death.
Yep,
he'll go to the death for this. It would do a major encouraging thing for new disciples who are like, okay, the people that didn't like you now don't like us, so we have a problem. So they go 200, almost 300 miles out of the way, the opposite direction to Antioch, and they continue on their journey, going through the city the long way to Antioch. And after this, Barnabas and Paul continued down to Perga and Pamphylia. They preached in that region for a time. They eventually made their way over to the nearby port city and then they sailed from there to Antioch in Acts 14 by the end. So then they return to Antioch itself. When they get back, they return. They stay there for a while. It doesn't say, Luke just says a long time after in verse 28.
Right.
Now, they traveled more than 800 miles by this point. Their first missionary journey consisted of about 800 miles and about 2 years, in my opinion. When Barnabas and Paul arrived back to Antioch in Syria, they shared all that the Lord had done, and it was a big deal. Then you come up to Acts 15, and you find the Jerusalem Council. So there was a reason for coming back too. So after returning, they learn about the Judaizers who are trying to make circumcision a necessity for salvation. Now, this group has been preaching, telling everybody what's going on. Paul and Barnabas are like, whoa. We're watching Gentiles left and right come to faith.
Right.
Circumcision has nothing to do with this. So you find a massive so-called church-wide, very small church-wide debate. This debate gets to the point where they have to do something about it. They go back to Jerusalem with all the apostles and others, and they meet there to discuss the issue of circumcision. We find that in Acts 15.
First ecumenical council.
It's the first ecumenical council. Again, it's a shorter ecumenicalism, but it is needed. Elders are coming. The apostles are there. This takes place around 50 AD, around that time, or as early as 48, as late as 51. Here they are. They're at the council. The council makes a decision. James gets the last word. They send out letters, all unanimously agreeing this is not necessary for salvation. They just stay away from things strangled with blood. There's a lot of Jews in synagogues. Just don't eat things with blood in it. Stay away from idolatry, etc. That's the conclusion they came to. Now, after the conclusion of this, Paul and Barnabas end up separating. So not long after the council, Barnabas and Paul get into a planning committee, how we want to do the second journey. Barnabas says, well, we're going to take John Mark again. Paul's like, no, we're not.
Absolutely not.
As a matter of sharp disagreement, verse 39 of chapter 15 tells us, they have to realize, okay, we're so split on this. And so they go on this missionary journey due to the disagreement. And Paul took Silas with him, and they don't go boat this time. So Barnabas and Mark, they go west into Cyprus. This time, the missionary journey changes. So I'm going to pull up the map here on that because I think it's important to note that Paul's second missionary journey is a little bit more coordinated.
It is.
Than the first one.
And it's a little bit more led by the Holy Spirit at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, we look at the split as this is bad. It's an unresolvable issue between two brothers who did great things in the first missionary journey. God used it actually for good. Somewhere along the way, Barnabas and John Mark connect with Peter. Peter's a better mentor. I don't know your thoughts on that, but Peter seems to be a better mentor. Maybe personality differences.
It just doesn't work out sometimes. Not that they weren't brothers in Christ anymore, but that some people just work better with other people.
Again, I do think that's a personality thing, perhaps, but Peter has a major influence on him. He sticks with him by the end of the time he's writing his letter, 1 Peter. Silas actually ends up going with Peter eventually too, because we find later in the book of 1 Peter, Silas writes the letter for him. So John Mark and Silas end up being fine together. So
yeah,
it's a necessity to show God did a good thing and the gospel advanced in two directions rather than one.
Right. I like to think that they resolved it later on just because of the, if Paul can resolve it with John Mark, then it seems likely that he could resolve it with Barnabas, but we don't know. We'll ask him when we get there.
I think so as well. I think that they possibly intellectually resolved it. I don't think John Mark resolved itself until Paul's on his death sentence. So he says he's profitable. We don't even know if Barnabas is alive at that point.
A lot of question marks.
So we don't know. But in eternity, it won't matter.
Right.
And again, the gospel advanced in two directions rather than one in this case. So here's the second missionary journey up on the screen to those who can see it. A little bit more succinct. Paul goes around. He goes up through Syria rather than taking the ship route across. Now, he's not exempt from a ship. He ends up getting on a
He
ship
gets there.
and he takes a long ship ride back.
Mm-hmm.
But in and of itself, he's not finished. So as we go into this second missionary journey, we find that Paul goes to Cilicia. Him and Silas start traveling northwest. They go up to the region of Cilicia, a Roman road that they would have used to get them to where Paul was actually from, in the city of Tarsus. Now, I think it would have been interesting for Paul to go back to his hometown in that region. And he has family members. He actually talks about family members later in the book of Romans. So he would have been an interesting challenge for his own family and friends that maybe knew him. Like, what happened to Paul?
Right.
The guy went and changed dramatically.
Kind of a Jesus going back to Nazareth kind of situation.
And sometimes a prophet is not received in his own country,
Yep.
Jesus said. So Paul and Silas made stops in churches all throughout the region along their way. And text explicitly says in chapter 15, he strengthened the brothers, strengthened these churches by being there. So he always ran into opposition, but he also encouraged the saints.
Mm-hmm.
The saints were always glad he was there. Judaizers, Greeks, not always.
Right.
So it's at this point in his journey, Paul and Silas met a young guy named Timothy. This is why I wonder if it was the best thing that they split. Because who knows? I mean, they couldn't even decide possibly on the location, much less the company that were to travel with them. So they go there and they run into a young man by the name of Timothy. He had a great reputation, and Paul decided to let Timothy come along with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then he circumcises Timothy in chapter 16, verse 3. Now, talk about why, even though he fought in the council prior, not necessitating circumcision, it did not mean he didn't see it was, sometimes it was necessitated, not for salvation, but for credibility.
Well, it goes into Paul's becoming all things for all people. You know, Timothy's coming with them. Paul knows that he's got all this Jewish opposition. He's running into it every single town that he comes into. And Timothy not being circumcised could have put a damper on the effectiveness of the ministry. And it could have been twisted into, well, see, he just says that you don't have to be circumcised because you got this buddy over here that he doesn't want to make go through it. And so Paul's willingness to be all things for all people. And then Timothy, you know, you got to give Timothy credit too, as an older guy being willing to be circumcised to go on this missionary journey. I mean, that's a big deal, you know.
It's going to hurt for a few days.
If you told a modern person that like you can come on this journey, but you got to get circumcised first, you're going to have to find somebody different to go on that journey with you. And I think it kind of, and I'm not saying that Luke is going into this, it's my own opinion. It kind of parallels the difference between him and John Mark. Like Timothy was willing to get circumcised. He was willing to go. I think for Paul, that probably bolstered his confidence in Timothy. And I think ultimately it was so that as they go into these cities where everything is hotly contested, everything is divisive, that's not something that they can use to point to and say, your ministry is ineffective. You're not saying something. And so Paul is, for the sake of the gospel, he's saying, you know, I think it's best if you get circumcised. Yep. And you see that Paul kind of does some of this stuff later on. He shaves his head for the Nazirite vow. He pays for the guys to go through it. There's a couple of times where Paul just leans into that Judaism because there's no reason.
To the Jew I became Jew, to the Greek I became a Greek.
Right. There's no reason to cause dissension. And the stuff that circumcision is not wrong. It's not like he asked Timothy to do something that is contrary to the gospel.
He wasn't doing it for salvation.
No. And so I don't think he's asking Timothy to do anything crazy. He's just saying, let's put the gospel at the forefront here and roll on. I think that's a lesson that we can all learn, that sometimes we have to do stuff that's not necessary in our freedom, right, that is more beneficial for the gospel.
All things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. Yep. And by his ministry, his effectiveness would have been hindered off of this.
Yep.
And this is something important because he knows what the council just decided. No doubt about it. He comes to realize by the time he writes to the church of Colossae that baptism replaced circumcision in Colossians chapter 2.
Yep.
So it's not an issue specifically of, I got to do this for the guy to get saved. No. It was effectiveness for ministry, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So they traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia. So he goes back to Galatia again in chapter 16 of Acts. So he's started a movement there, goes back on his travels the long way. Now he hits Galatia again. So this is his third time being in Galatia at this point. And he's wanting to advance the gospel there, but they were restricted in doing so at many places. And so they have to travel to Mysia, which is in modern-day northwest Turkey, attempting to make their way to Bithynia. But again, restriction, and the Spirit himself diverts and moves them in a different direction in chapter 16, verse 7, which I think is huge because it comes to Paul's benefit that the Spirit actually diverts away into a different direction. So they end up in Troas. While in Troas, he meets Luke. Apparently, Luke is a part of his investigation. Now, Luke does not include himself in the text. Like, and there he met the physician, Luke.
Right.
It's just next thing you know, there's this we, us, and our guy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I call him, the we, us, and our. So Luke joins the missionary team, and it doesn't explicitly give all the details to that, but it's clear he's there because he starts using the third person. In chapter 16, verse 10, Luke begins to speak in the first person as if he had joined the team, and now he's in the travels with Paul, which becomes instrumental because he writes the Gospel of Luke,
Mm-hmm.
and he writes the missionary journeys of Paul that we are now discussing, and we can actually say, oh, that's where Paul went.
Right.
So if you just take Paul's letters, you have no idea which journey he's on
Mm-hmm.
and in the course in which he took that journey.
Right. And plus just the value he added to Paul's life, being a physician, being there with him, being there, the whole time through and being that comfort that he probably missed from being with Barnabas as an encourager.
So now he's got Silas, he's got Timothy, he's got Luke.
Mm-hmm. He's picking up people on this trip.
And a lot of young guys.
Yep.
A lot of these are young guys, and he's investing in them.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be understood because it can get missed in the pages of Scripture. He didn't just bring them on for companionship.
Right.
He intends to use every single one of these in these churches.
Well,
he's training them.
Yeah, he knew how Jesus trained the apostles. He's like, okay, if you feel this call, you're coming with me, and we're going to travel together just the same way that Jesus traveled with his apostles. Obviously, much farther than he traveled, but the same kind of concepts. Travel with me, be with me, imitate me as I imitate Christ, as he says later on in his epistles.
So you find that this is a Spirit-led thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Spirit restricts him from going the direction he wants to go. Because while he's in Troas, he gets a Macedonian call.
Mm-hmm.
He gets this vision of a man that says, come help us. We need your help. In verses 9 through 10 of chapter 16. So he gets this vision. Now he hops on a ship. And he goes and he sails across the Aegean Sea to the island of the Samothrace. And there he goes to Neapolis, near Greece. It is here we find a major conversion of great church people that will many years set the tone for a lot of churches in the history, going all the way into the 2nd and 3rd century.
Yep.
So this missionary group travels to Philippi. We find Luke takes some time to actually tell us some stories, not just he went here, spent some time so people could. He actually takes time to tell us of a very famous story of the Philippian jailer.
Mm-hmm.
So him and he and Silas get arrested. They're beaten.
Mm-hmm.
They're put in jail. They're stuck in the very, very depths of jail. And at midnight, they're singing and praying.
Right. They're singing hymns and having them a good old time.
So what ends up happening?
The walls shake. Everything goes crazy. The doors open. All the chains fall off. Not just Paul and Silas's, but everybody in the jail. And so the jailer kind of realizes it. And he's like, the Romans will execute me for this. And so I'm just going to skip a step.
It's going to
follow his sword, calling him sword. And Paul's like, whoa, we're all still here. We're just chilling. We're just hanging out. It's fine. And through this experience of hearing them worship, seeing the miraculous, and then talking to Paul and Silas, the Philippian jailer gets saved, and not just him, but his entire household is baptized. And it radically changes that whole area.
Yeah, and what led to his imprisonment was not because he did anything wrong. He cast a demon out of a girl who was making money for a guy. The guy gets mad about it because she's freed from this demon, and he couldn't make any more money through fortune telling.
Mm-hmm.
So he ends up getting arrested. This is what got him in there to begin with.
Yeah, she's walking around saying, you're preachers of the one true God. She's constantly doing it all the time. And Paul just says, be gone, demon.
And as a result, he's arrested. Silas is arrested. People are mad, but it ends up leading to conversion of many, many people.
Mm-hmm.
So while they are now released, they take off to Thessalonica. Very, very important city, because it is here that Paul will later write 2 separate letters to the Thessalonians. Paul makes it all the way to Amphipolis and Ampania, and comes to Thessalonica in chapter 17 of Acts. At this moment, Paul goes into the synagogue as usual, preaches to the Jews. Once again, you have major issues. He gets into a couple subjects here. And again, this is where actually Luke being on the scene gives us details, not just that he went and there was resistance.
Yeah.
He gets into a couple things. Sabbath days. He gets into the discussion of feast, Sabbath, and the importance of how they point to Jesus of Nazareth. People come to faith. People get saved, including Gentiles. Yet again, as we see, Paul becomes opposed by angry, jealous people. They cause a major uproar. One of the brothers that was welcoming Paul there, his name was Jason. The Jews dragged Jason in front of the city leaders, and Jason's released, but he's beat up for doing it.
You never went to jail in that time without getting flogged some sort of way, shape, or form.
He didn't get to stay long at all. This is the sad part, which is why I think he ended up writing 2 letters. He speaks of his attachment to these people because he had to quickly be taken out of the city.
Yeah.
So they continue. They leave Thessalonica after the persecution. The trouble comes there. And even though they're gone, the city of churches does very, very well. Guys like Jason and others end up doing very, very well for the church. So they take off to then Berea. Paul, again, goes to the synagogue. And again, he gets some responses. But this time it's a little bit different. Instead of mobs, the Jews actually examine the scriptures to see if what Paul is saying is true.
They're a little bit more level-headed in Berea.
Now, let me just pause here on a pet peeve. People say, be like the Berean Christians. Stop. They weren't Christians yet. Just say, be like the Bereans.
Right.
They searched the scriptures to see if the things were true. We say, like, we need to be like the Bereans. We do, but what should be noted is the Bereans were skeptics, not Christians.
Right.
They became Christian after they searched the scriptures to see. That's just a pet peeve of mine.
Gotcha.
So be a Berean Christian.
Though it is good to be a Berean type of person. Be willing to look through and say, maybe my belief is not true. Maybe let's see the evidence. At least show me what you're talking about before I, stone you to death. Which is what happened. I mean,
don't jump to conclusions.
We're not modern day stoning people, but if you've been on the internet,
you get stoned differently.
Right.
It's called words.
Yeah, it's internet stoning.
Now, I love what Luke says here as he acknowledges the 2 differences between Thessalonica and Berea. He says that the Thessalonians, in comparison to the Bereans were more noble than the Jews at Thessalonica. So,
a little shout out.
He clearly didn't like the Thessalonians that much there.
Yeah.
So things seem to go good in the city of Berea. People become Christians. But Jews from Thessalonica heard that Paul was teaching in the Berean synagogues, of course. So they travel. They make a special trip,
right?
Of course, to stir crowds in trouble. We thought that protesting was bad in our day. I mean, people traveled a good way back then and they didn't have cars.
Wait till we get to some of the later journeys.
So the brothers there send Paul away, but Silas and Timothy actually stay behind in the city of Berea and continue to minister. So then the Apostle Paul was escorted by some of the brothers about 300 miles.
They said, we've got to get you without outside of travel distance between these mobs that are just following you.
You think 30 miles would have been sufficient. Apparently it's not.
In that day, it should have been.
They had to go 300. So they go south. They go 300 miles south into the regions of Achaia, reaching to the city of Athens. There they arrive in Athens. The brothers go back to the cities of Berea and Thessalonica. Paul stays in Athens and tells Silas and Timothy, who were left back there, he wanted them to join him as soon as possible.
So they're left kind of continuing to equip the saints there. He's like, all right, well, we still got business. So
which goes to show Paul was their target more than these others, although Silas is thrown in prison multiple times too.
Yeah.
So while Paul waits for his 2 companions to come back, the Spirit provoked him in verse 16 of chapter 17, because he saw an abundance of idols in the area. So he gets up, he uses his time, he goes in the synagogue, he preaches into the Gentiles in the marketplace, which you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
in the marketplace. He talks to Epicureans and Stoic philosophers. This is probably fun for Paul in some ways.
Probably. Paul's a little bit of an intellect, and he likes getting into these conversations. If you've read Romans, you know.
He's been fighting Jews. That debate gets repetitive.
Right.
He actually gets a new debate here.
Right.
And he goes to them, and he goes to the courts and discusses philosophy, things of the world, how things function. And he begins to use philosophy to point to Jesus.
And it shows just how educated Paul really was.
Yep.
I mean, the guy was insane with his knowledge base and his ability to speak, and just the gifting that the Holy Spirit had laid on him at his salvation, not to mention the education he had already had, but he's the ability to just debate anybody at any point. He's on top of it.
Well, he talks about how he actually uses their philosophers to point to Christian theology.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks about their superstition,
which is just genius.
It's like, hey, I noticed over here you got an unknown God image.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you about him. Right. So he gets up, preaches one of his famous sermons in this place of Athens. After hearing Paul's sermon, there were some who laughed at him and said, this guy's insane. There were some who actually believed. Some joined his journey. Some joined in Christianity by the end of the text. So then he leaves Athens. He travels 53 miles, particularly down to Corinth. After he gets to Corinth, this is his second journey. He travels about total of 1,500 miles. Folks, no airplanes, no trains, no buses, no cars.
Feet, camel, and boat.
Feet, camel, and boat, and a couple of horseback rides.
Right.
That's it. The Apostle Paul arrives in Corinth about 8 to 12 months after the start of the second missionary journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's likely he goes there in the late year, around 51, maybe 52, depending on how you date the Council of Jerusalem. So here in Corinth, Silas and Timothy arrive. They meet up with him. While there, Paul meets two Jews from Rome, Aquila and Priscilla. Corinth becomes a major port city, major part for Christianity. Now, we give them flack for their carnality. Right. They were a big, wealthy church.
Right.
And they became instrumental to funding many of the Christians that go out.
Mm-hmm.
An offering's taken back to Jerusalem. Corinth gets 2 letters that are inspired letters. And they have other letters in addition to that where Paul does a lot of correspondence.
Right, yeah. He really spent a lot of time in Corinth.
Now, Aquila and Priscilla become important.
Massive.
Huge helps to Paul.
Mm-hmm.
They help with Apollos later on. They get him on the straight and narrow and up to date.
They go ahead of him a couple of places to prepare the church there before he gets there.
Especially Rome. Help with a lot with the orphans and all the issues that are there.
And that was when Rome was like the worst place to get sent to because it was bad in Rome for Christians.
Now, they were instrumental, too, in how they funded the ministry of Paul because it turns out Paul ends up getting the tent making.
Mm-hmm.
They're tent makers.
Yep.
So Aquila, Priscilla, and Paul do tent making to fund their ministry. Paul didn't want to have to use money from the churches. He tried to count for himself.
And he was in Corinth for a while. It's, he was there for like a year and a half. So I mean, he had to take care of himself and not be a burden on the believers in Corinth, especially when they're starting out.
He had less resistance there.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, it's a trade area. He felt like he could make a good amount of money.
Right.
So by tent making, he actually accumulated money to pay for his next direction and so forth. He wanted to earn money.
That's the one benefit from Corinth being such a crazy place. A new philosophy really wasn't that big of a deal in their day. It's like, it's just somebody else teaching something different. If you're that carnal, then you usually don't mind other teaching.
No, and they welcomed any kind of different perspective.
Yeah,
which is why many of the Gentiles believe there. Now the Jews gave him a lot of pushback, per the usual.
Yeah,
but a lot of Gentiles were open and receptive. Some of them, shrugged it off. Some actually said, that's interesting, and they actually came to faith.
Yep.
So while in Corinth, the Apostle Paul wrote his letters to the Thessalonians because at this point it was a dead issue to go back. He knew his enemies were awaiting him there.
Right.
Best thing to do, send the letter. So he writes the first letter to the Thessalonians because they apparently had written him and had questions. Naturally, I mean, think about it. He was there and gone, left Silas and Timothy for a short time to educate. They can only educate so far because they're learning too.
Right. And they really probably weren't there that long.
No. Not long at all, because it's probably about 3 months, and then they got to start going 300 miles themselves.
And if you've got new converts and you say you've got a month to ask me everything that you need to know, there's going to be a lot left on the table that they still need to learn about.
So in that letter, he tells them what they need to know because they have questions about the resurrection and
It's-
coming of
It
Jesus.
sounds like they have some misunderstandings about how it works. They're a little fearful about people that die before the resurrection comes. And so he responds and clarifies some issues there.
And that makes sense because you're going to have views of death from the Gentiles. You're going to have views of death from the Jews who do teach in a resurrection.
Right.
But they're going to have a different nuance to the resurrection. He's teaching resurrection by Jesus' return.
Right.
The Jews are waiting for the first arrival of Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, no, he already came.
Right.
And he's going to come again.
A lot of competing ideas.
It makes sense that they would want to know about something like that.
Yeah. Let's just get this straight.
Like, how do we view the resurrection? So he writes a letter and he tells them to withstand the persecution that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
He tells them to withstand it, fight for their belief, understand what they've been delivered to them was true.
Yep.
And that it's worth it to suffer in this life for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So he gives them instructions on how to live godly, how to deal with the resurrection, the coming of Christ. And he continues to preach the word while they're in Corinth for 18 months, like you said. Many were saved. The church is established. Jews are mad, per the usual.
Right.
The Jews at Corinth eventually get tired of it. They bring the Apostle Paul before the Roman proconsul, Gallio. And what ended up happening is the older brother of renown and the philosophers out of there, the tutor to actually probably Emperor Nero, Gallio refused to even hear the case about Paul. He just says, look,
I don't care.
Get him out of here. So in Acts 18, he's sent away from the courts. Now, he stays in Corinth for, we don't know how long. Paul is just recorded as saying many days. Luke says many days after.
Mm-hmm.
After being brought to Gallio, he started his journey back to Antioch of Syria, which again, headquarters, and plans to make a step to Ephesus. And Aquila and Priscilla apparently come with him. Now, Paul's crew traveled nearby port city of Cenchreae and 8 miles from there from Corinth. Now, we don't know how long he stayed there, but it was long enough for Paul to have shaved his head, which is what you referred to earlier in Acts 18:18. It's possible he stopped for and it seems to be a very brief time, and he moves forward. There does seem to be evidence that Paul spent significant time with these people, either once or twice, but nobody really knows. So then he takes a brief visit to Ephesus. He arrives then at Ephesus, huge port city,
right?
Huge for the gospel, transfer of letters, becomes very important later, even after Paul's lifetime. John himself spends time here. So a church is going to be formed here. He goes in the synagogue. He talks about with the Jews again about Jesus. He visits Ephesus with a brief time because he wasn't met with reception.
Right. He does come back later, though.
He does go back. Back.
And Ephesus gets wild. We'll talk about it in the next episode.
Oh, boy. They requested for him to stay in the city longer. He declined and said, I have to return and do God's will in Acts 8:21. Paul made plans to leave. Priscilla and Aquila stay in the city of Ephesus. Again, they stay in a lot of places for him.
Right.
Paul travels from Ephesus to Caesarea. Once he travels there, he visits the believers in the region and preaches the gospel in various towns and places. And he briefly visits Jerusalem and travels back to Antioch in Syria. So his missionary journey lasted about 2.5 years, a little longer than the first.
Right.
Possibly even up to 3 years, and likely ended back in Antioch around the year 53 to 54. Now I'm going to pull up the map so everybody can see that once again. Here's the travel. He does get on ship. He goes back, and then he rests there in the city of Antioch, his headquarters. So a long journey, a lot of opposition, but also a lot of reception. Many more churches are started in his second missionary journey, and instrumental ones that become the main traveling ground for his third and possibly fourth. And then we see the New Testament dispersed to these. And then we even see the ministry of John and Andrew and others later go to these areas.
Right. And then you've got, he picks up Timothy on this, which we've got letters to Timothy, and Timothy was huge in Ephesus.
Yep.
Priscilla and Aquila are huge in this. Silas ends up doing great things for the gospel. And so this trip really is crucial for the early stages of the church as far as setting out leaders and establishing churches and really strengthening the churches that were there. The reason, we've got the letters we do, and the reason that we can trace our roots back to some of these places because Paul made these missionary journeys and strengthened these believers at a time where they were very heavily persecuted, and it really could have gone the other way had it not been for the Spirit in Paul's efforts.
Yes. And and through this journey, they receive letters. You have the Church of Philippi gets Philippians.
Mm-hmm.
Corinthians gets 2 inspired letters in addition to many more. Ephesus gets a letter. You start finding Corinth, all these cities, they get letters.
Right.
Galatia gets a letter.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes important. And then individuals that go to those cities, 1st and 2nd Timothy, get 2 letters in addition to the book of Ephesus. These are important letters that change the trajectory of how we understand theology.
Mm-hmm. Because Paul's writing the same way we do. We've got questions about things, and we would ask our pastor, we ask our priest. They're writing to Paul, and Paul, in response, is giving them doctrine. And the reason we have as much as we have is because they asked, and Paul was able to respond.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the first 2 journeys of Paul. These are the elements in which he traveled. So when looking at the missionary journey of Paul, all of Christianity really does hinge on the Spirit of God moving this man to go to the places that he did.
Mm-hmm.
We need guys like Paul. We need guys to be out there doing this, because we lose so much without this, because he picks up Luke, which also gets his Acts.
Yep.
And a whole new perspective of Jesus in his parable teaching, like the parable of the lost son and the lost sheep. We see the Good Samaritan. We find all these things in Luke's collection that he finds in his journeys that we don't find in the other synoptics.
Right.
These are essential journeys for our Christian faith, because our Christian faith hinges off the work that he did in them.
Yep. I agree completely. If Paul didn't go on these missionary journeys and sacrifice his life in the way that he did, then we would not be sitting here the way that we are and able to talk about with as much confidence as we do. And so I think this speaks to the effectiveness of missionary journeys. I think it's essential that we continue to have men and women that are willing to go and do the things and to face the persecution to reach these people that are still haven't heard the gospel. It's something the church needs to continually get behind, is reaching unreached people groups and establishing churches there, because those people need the gospel just the same way that the churches in Paul's day needed. And we need to strengthen and do the things that Paul was doing.
Well said. I couldn't say it better myself. And we have a pattern on how to do this the proper way. We're going to get more into that in the next episode.
Mm-hmm.
So keep your eyes and ears open for the next episode. We'll finish up the last 2. And yes, I said 2, and you'll see why I think there's 2 more. Journeys of Paul, and the pattern that is left behind for us to follow. Now, if you are listening to us for the first time and you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. That way you see new videos that come out. There's going to be new releases, new content that come in addition to having guests on. If you're on the podcast, you're listening on your favorite platform, Spotify, Apple, Podbean, Google platform, whatever it is, make sure you like us on there. Leave us some reviews too. We'd like some good feedback. There's a lot of good reviews out there. We appreciate all that you do in supporting us. A website is being built. It is underway. Patreon accounts are going to be done. Working on that. I got somebody on that as we speak. Many of you have asked about how you can give towards Facts now that we are a nonprofit organization, and it'll actually help you and on your taxes and things like that.
Yep.
We're glad to be that for you. We have our entire group together. Folks, thanks again for supporting and being behind this podcast and all that you have done for us and will continue to help as the Lord leads. Grace and peace to you. God bless.